Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Barb Kabilas. I'm the Regional Stroke Education Coordinator for Central South. And as a pandemic bonus, we are able to offer and open this session to our colleagues across the province, as we don't all have to fit in one room or travel. And our other pandemic bonus is that we can reach out to speakers such as Charlie Chung from overseas in Scotland to join us today, and he found the travel quite easy from one part of his house to the other, I believe. Charlie Chung is a stroke specialist, occupational therapist, and manager of multi-professional inpatient and community assessment and rehabilitation center services. His work history includes mental health and community occupational therapy positions, with 5 years of working in rehab facilities across the USA. His clinical work is currently provided in post-stroke cognition clinic. Charlie is the lead author of the Cochrane Review on Cognitive Rehabilitation for Executive Dysfunction After Stroke, and he completed his PhD thesis on the expression of executive function after stroke through narrative and observable actions. He's delivered his cognition and executive function intervention workshops across the UK, in Australia, and in Canada. And he's delighted with the opportunity to deliver this cognition and perception workshop to the professions of the Central South Regional Stroke Network and also across Ontario today. So welcome, Charlie. We look forward to hearing more. We have 172 people registered for today. They're not all on yet, but we'll join us when they can. And thank you for allowing us to record this session and for providing us with the pre-work so that we didn't have to spend all those hours at once in front of the computer. So welcome,
Sure.
Charlie.
Thank you very much, Barb. It is a real pleasure to be presenting to you all today, particularly with so many people having registered for the session. Thank you so much for viewing the slides and the narrative before the workshop today. And for those of you that maybe feel that you've forgotten aspects of it, because you're to be congratulated, because it was quite a long haul, wasn't it, between 2 and 3 hours of listening to me go through slides. So I will revise some of that today as well before we go into the activities. So regard today's workshop as a bit of consolidation, but also as an opportunity to come in with any chat or ask any questions. I hope to be quite tight with time. I say this in every workshop that I do, actually tend to go to the wire, but I'm going to make an especially great effort today to actually make sure that we finish well before the finish time of 12 noon, that you have just to field any questions and conversations on the chat then. The objectives, these are the ones from the slide, so the objectives remain the same. You understand we have a multi-professional participation here today, so it really is, I'm hoping that you can take from this and apply it to your own practice, regardless of what profession you are. To be able to apply the cognition knowledge for your assessments, to be able to understand common changes in perception after stroke as well. I say at this point that in no way does the perception section here represent everything there is. It's a huge area, but at least it touches upon it and gives a feel for it. So I've not tried to cover all of perception here, but just to give a little indication. So here is in the broad outline. After my introduction, we'll go into cognition recap. There are a couple of poll questions coming up as well. I have a slide to indicate when we will do these. Then we will have the quizzes, moving into scenarios, a break up around about halfway through. Then we're looking at the perception apraxia type element of the workshop, and again scenarios to reinforce that, and finishing off with summary and key points. As there's so many people on, and I understand that some of you are in groups anyway, when we come to the breakout sessions, we won't actually be getting you into groups at that time. If you're by yourself, please take the pause and to think through, take some notes if you like, and then after, given a set number of minutes, I'll come back in and provide some of the answers and the justification, but also use the time as well. We feel welcome to use the chat function at these periods where we pause to represent the breakout rooms. So here are the poll questions, and I'll hand over to Barb to get these out to you all.
I hope you can see the poll. Oh, some of you can. I see the answers. Please rate your level of knowledge of cognition after stroke prior to viewing the presentation. No one put no knowledge, so that's great.
That's great.
Okay, most of you have answered. So I'm going to end the poll and show the results.
Okay, thanks everyone. So there's quite a spread there. Of course, the important thing is to see whether that has changed from after the presentation, also whether it changes from the consolidation exercises in the workshop today.
Okay. Oh, so I'll show you the second poll. Sorry. This is about your pre-workshop confidence. And here's our results.
Okay, thanks again, everyone. That's great. So again, another spread and the bulge in the middle of the scoring. So that's very reassuring for me to know that people are coming from a background where you have, some knowledge because you're working with people, with a stroke. So this stuff isn't unfamiliar, but the hope is that there's room to move forward and to use some of this knowledge. So thank you very much, and thank you, Barb, for setting these poll questions up. If you're okay with this, we'll repeat the questions at the end just to see if there's any shift in scores at that point. And it's a nice way to see whether any of this information delivery has been effective or not. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barb. So let's go into a little bit of a recap. And you will recall that produced a framework on the slides before, which is usually the accepted way of looking at cognition, where cognition is made up of different domains. We have attention, we have memory, and we have executive function as the main domains. Sometimes you will see information processing in there, or visual processing as part of that, and sometimes you'll see language as part of that, as well as a cognitive function. And for the purposes of this workshop, this is the components of attention. And we have focused attention, which is the act of hearing or seeing or feeling a stimulus and simply directing your attention to the stimulus, nothing more. Very quick type of function where hear a sound and we turn to it, or we become more alert, and that is us focusing our attention. Then we have sustained attention, which is maintaining our attention over time, usually to something that's quite mundane or boring. And I say that but to make the point that if something is grabbing your attention each time, for instance, a noise is happening or different people are speaking, and that brings us into a different element of having our attention drawn to something, whereas an element of sustained attention. A good example is actually within the assessment, if anybody has ever seen a test of everyday attention, and there is the elevator test in there. And what you're asked to do, or what your person you're testing is asked to do, is to determine the floor which the elevator arrives on through a series of beeps and noises. And what the person's got to do is just to really count the number of noises which corresponds to the number of floors to arrive on the floor. So although it's an auditory stimulus, it's quite a mundane stimulus, and person has to sustain their attention on that. Another example from this is so us having to remain vigilant, having to remain alert to something happening. So if you ask somebody to tap the table whenever an ace appears, if you turn over a deck of cards, one card at a time, you're asking them to sustain their attention on the task. They're looking at the various cards coming out and remaining vigilant and alert and responding when the target card is reached. Selective attention, it's the type of attention that can be thought of like a flashlight beam. And when we sit, as well as having our visual fields, we also have our attentional fields. And in order to take information in, we have control of these attentional fields and generally move the attentional field to where we need to take that information in. So if we are lying on the couch and somebody starts talking to us, the tendency is we will want to sit up and turn our head towards that person because we're optimizing our ability to take the information in from their conversation. And finally, divided attention, which is attending to more than one stimulus at one time. And there's probably more to it than that. In the presentation, I don't go too far into this, but usually with divided attention, we'll find that one of the things is usually more of an automatic type of function, and one requires more higher level thinking. So for instance, when you're walking and talking, the walking aspect of that function is on a more automatic level, allowing that resource, the attentional resource, to be on the actual conversation. And of course, we run into difficulties when we try to divide our attention between two things that require very deliberate, conscious, higher level cognition. So these are the main attention types. And for those of you who already are familiar with some of this information, you may have thought, well, where's alternating attention? And the definition of alternating attention is when we are having our attention on one thing, we're perhaps looking at a book with directions on how to build furniture, then we turn our attention to building the furniture, then back to the instruction book again, and back to the furniture. And that alternating attention describes that process. But the reason why I've left it out of attention is when we come to the executive function components, it can be described as flexibility and task shifting, to be able to be on one thing and then be on another thing and back onto the first thing again. So, but it's, so again, there's no right and wrong behind this, and there's no problem, if you want to, just consider alternating attention as one of the attention types. The other thing to pick out from this slide, which I may mention briefly in the presentation, is that there are different circuits in the brain that are associated with these attention types, which means that sometimes somebody can have a sustained attention issue if their anterior thalamus is as involved, has been damaged or affected by the stroke, yet have okay selective attention, and vice versa between all these different components. So people can have a very individual type of presentation. So that brings us to our first quiz, and you will either have this in paper form in front of you, or you will have this actually on screen, which you can do now. So I will just pause I'll give you 5 minutes to do this, and I'll pause and I'll look out for any comments coming through, any questions. But otherwise, if you'd like to do this, and after 5 minutes, I'll come back in again and show you certainly the answers that I have, but bear in mind that separating these processes out is very artificial, and realistically all these attentional mechanisms work in conjunction with each other. So if our answers differ, that's not a problem, because you can usually be able to justify why you've selected the answer that you've selected. So let me give you 5 minutes just starting from now. It's a good question coming through from Winnie there as you're doing this. What's the difference between focused versus selective attention? Focused attention is a very immediate reaction to a stimulus coming in, and it's correct when he says that it does involve selective attention to then turn, to actually move your attentional fields towards that stimulus. But if we were to really pull in the definition, it really is that first alert and just recognizing the stimulus. Whereas you're quite right, Winnie, if you do then turn to the stimulus or immediately turn to the stimulus, you are using some form of selective attention there. But another element which sets selective attention aside is the ability to actually pick out things from a number of other different things. So it's not just coming onto one stimulus. It's actually, if there are 10 stimuli, being able to pick out the target stimuli and ignore the other stimuli. So that's the added aspect of selective attention. I hope that answers your question. You're very welcome, Winnie. It's actually nice to have questions, because I've delivered some workshops where there's been absolutely no response because I can't see anybody here, and it feels like being in a room by myself. And when there's no interaction, it does feel strange compared to doing live face-to-face workshops. So I do appreciate any questions coming through. It makes me feel less alone. Okay, just last minute and a half or so. So for those of you who are on your own, you'll probably be able to do this very quickly. Those of you that are in a room with other people, I imagine there'll be various debates going on with some of these. Okay, that's our 5 minutes up. I hope everybody was okay with that. So following the recipe from an iPad while baking, and again, I'll just reinforce the point that you can sometimes argue for different processes, because to do that, of course, you need focused attention, but for the purposes of illustrating the particular aspect of attention, then the main one there is divided attention, and to be able to keep the information coming from the iPad while baking and doing that as well. Finding a specific serving spoon from a cutlery drawer. And as I said a couple of minutes ago, it's really about moving this attentional beam in order to be able to pick one thing out amongst other things, whether that is visual or whether that is to do with hearing as well. Having a conversation while driving, divided attention. And it's another example where if the road is straight and not too complex, then you can be driving in very much a routine procedural mode, which we'll talk about coming on, but hopefully you remember that from the presentation, while having a conversation, which is the more deliberate, conscious action. Reading a book in a quiet room, and that's really to illustrate sustained attention. Turning your head in response to an object falling off a table is really to illustrate focused attention. Similarly, just sitting up when someone suddenly speaks to you, focused attention, and picking out a conversation in a noisy room, an example of selective attention, an auditory version of that. Working through a series of simple calculations, and the operating word is simple here, which is more of a sustained attention task, rather than if it was complex calculations, then it's a different type of thing altogether. And counting the number of repetitions during exercise, that's intended to illustrate an example of divided attention. And stepping on the brake when a ball bounces in front of your car, and focused attention. So hopefully that the purpose of that you find useful in consolidating the different types of attention. And you can probably see examples of when people have difficulty with some of these things after stroke in your clinical practice. So for instance, if somebody without attentional problems is walking with a frame, for instance, for the first time, they can probably generally use the frame as well as taking information around them. But if somebody does have a divided attention issue and you begin talking to the person while they're using the frame for the first time, there is an element where, they may lose their balance because they cannot attend to the conversation and the use of the new frame at the same time. Okay, so
sorry to interrupt. I wasn't sure if you saw the question from Jacqueline. Since selective attention is in the right temporoparietal complex, do you ever see issues with it in someone with a left hemisphere stroke? Also, does it tend to affect more a person's attention to the left side of the space?
Oh, that's a good question. As you've correctly identified, I'm going to bring the question up so I can see the question. Oh no, was it a verbal question, or is it, yeah, for some reason I'm not seeing it.
It's in the chat.
All right, okay. My menu has disappeared. While I'm trying to bring that up, I'll answer from what I can remember, and please keep me right. Yes, so we're talking selective attention right parietal lobe, does it ever happen if there's been a left hemisphere event and the left parietal lobe is affected? It's probably correct, because the statistics are that around 80% of people with spatial problems and inattention tend to be people with right hemisphere issues. So we'll see it a lot less, although it's not absolute, in that there can be other reasons why somebody's hemispheres have different locations. And one of the first questions that I'll often ask people, if things are a bit unclear and somebody's presenting in not a defined way in terms of right hemisphere, expect selective attention and attentional orientation problems, is whether the person is left-handed or right-handed, and if the person is right-handed, whether they were made to use their right hand when they were young, for instance. And very occasionally, sometimes people's function has been turned around in their brain. So similarly, when somebody has a right hemisphere stroke and there's been a language issue which they're having word finding difficulties, you can sometimes see that presentation. But in the most part, those people with right hemisphere stroke do tend to have that selective attention and spatial attention that we'll come to look at as well later on issues. But that's not to say that there are not exceptions to that rule. There are also things that can sometimes present as difficulties that don't match what we regard as laterality, and the side of the stroke equals the presentation. And an example of that is when you see written a right-sided neglect, for instance, which seems to indicate that the person is not taking in information, not attending to anything on the right side of space, when more commonly you would expect to see that on the left side of space. And where that's not impossible, it is less frequent. It's important to distinguish that from somebody who maybe has a right visual field loss and sensory loss in the right side of their body, and whether that's the reason why the person appears not to be attending to that side of space, or whether it is actually a damaged attentional mechanism to the right side of space. Yeah, does that help to answer that question? Okay. Oh, I found the chat function. Sorry, I wasn't finding the chat function. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Jacqueline, for that great question. I hope my answer wasn't too garbled there. Okay, so on to memory. And again, from the presentation, then we focused first of all on our long-term memory processes, which there are two types: non-declarative memory, which can be described and summarized as the type of memory we don't think about. It's not really our conscious memory. And a big part of non-declarative memory is procedural memory, the riding the bike type of memory, where we do things so often, we've learned it so well, we don't even think about it when we're doing it. And that's procedural memory. There are other aspects of memory, such as conditioning, and I always experience this whenever, probably in the summer, and I don't know if it's because I wear cheap nylon clothing or not, but whenever I get out of the car, often I'll experience static electrical shocks off the bodywork of the car. And it got so bad at one point through this conditioning that I had to discharge myself on tires in order to make sure that I wasn't going to get that shock. So that's an example of conditioning. But the key thing that we're really wanting to keep our attention on is the idea of declarative memory, which is our more conscious memory. And the fact that that can be divided into two different types of memory, where we have the memory for events, which is episodic memory, or autobiographical memory is another term for that, and facts, semantic memory, language-based facts. That's important because when we see results of assessments, very often, particularly with screening tools, there is the memory for words. And some of the tests, for instance, like the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, there are 5 words that need to be remembered. So somebody can actually lose 5 points out of a possible 30 points in that test, and there's a conclusion made that the person has memory problems, when in fact that same person may be able to remember everything that's happened that morning and the day before and the week before. So more accurately, the person may have semantic memory challenges, but actually their episodic memory is okay. So it's always worthwhile determining, okay, if there's a memory issue that somebody you're working with is facing, what type of memory is it? How do it's useful to pin that down, because then we can use more appropriate strategies if it is pinned down. And we'll look at that when we do the scenarios later on. With short-term memory, the key thing here is that working memory is included in short-term memory, and we'll come to look at that in a second. But one thing that for those of you sharp-eyed won't see in that diagram is the idea of prospective memory. And prospective memory is considered an executive function, but the definition of prospective memory is remembering to do things that are in the future, remembering to keep an appointment, remembering to bring the cake out of the oven at the correct time, remembering to call a friend later on. And here is the concept of working memory. And hopefully the presentation, I was able to express this, but I think it's always worthwhile going through this again, because I regard this as certainly one of the most important concepts within cognition that we see all the time in practice. And if you've ever worked with somebody who is able to, tell you exactly what they're doing, what they're about to do, and seem to have their life just on track, whereas when they actually come to do that thing, they somehow get muddled, they have a lot of difficulty with it, and very often working memory is the reason that behind some of these difficulties. It can be thought of as our capacity for holding and manipulating and coordinating information. So again, this is a reminder from the presentation, is conceptualized into these 4 elements, where the central executive is the part which controls the information coming in. So we don't just respond reactively to things, we sometimes do, but we do have the central executive which helps us make decisions and to plan and to organize and judge things. And that's where the central executive helps to control these other mechanisms that are ongoing. The left hemisphere is associated with the phonological loop, and the phonological loop is the concept of our left hemisphere having a piece of recording, audio recording tape running all the time, which holds some information which is temporary, and when we use that information we don't need it anymore, so we can let that information go. Whereas with the visual spatial sketch pad associated with the right hemisphere of our brain is related to, like, and again, apologies for using these very old examples, but a blackboard, a chalkboard, for instance, where we can draw things up temporarily, and then once we don't need that information anymore, and we can wipe it clean. And the episodic buffer is the concept where our brain pulls together full memory experiences rather than just auditory memory or visual memory being separate from each other. It's the mechanism that we can recall whole experiences, including smells and tastes and how things touch, and it's all integrated into our system. So the example I gave here was the whole supermarket example of using working memory, where you're carrying a list of maybe 5 items that somebody has asked you to purchase in the store, and the phonological loop is holding on to these pieces of information while you're pushing the trolley around the supermarket. You're passing through the first aisle, your visual spatial sketch pad is picking up on the information that's on the shelves, on the visual information, but you're not finding the things you're looking for in the phonological loop. Then you move down to the next aisle, and already your visual spatial sketchpad is just let go of a lot of the visual information that it had processed when you went down the first aisle, because you do not need it anymore. You find the first thing, your phonological loop can let that first item go, and so on and so forth as you go around. But other things may come into load on working memory, and that is you may feel hungry, and it's actually taking up some of your thoughts, and you're drawing upon long-term memory processes and remembering when you last ate and what you had. And then again, you're pushing the trolley further, and other information may need to be coordinated, such as the wheel, which is sticking on your trolley. So you're having to process that, as well as keep the information going around your phonological loop, as well as continue to process that visual information. So you can see how our brains are always coordinating information in these types of situations. And after stroke, it's reckoned that over 3/4 of people will have a limitation with working memory, meaning that they are going to have more difficulty in coordinating this information. So the type of situation where they may be able to do one thing, but add another thing, or add a level of complexity or other layer of thinking, then they may run into problems with that. So working memory certainly is a, a, a concept to hold on to, but also to realize that in practice, many people, if not most people that you're working with, may have reduced working memory, and we may have to act accordingly to ensure that they are supported to take in information and to coordinate that information, whether it's through simplification, whether it's playing to their strengths. So for instance, if somebody has had a left hemisphere stroke, and even though they maybe are not aphasic, and their processing of language still may have been affected, so much so that if they're given information in verbal format, and we're telling them lots of things and give them a lot of verbal instructions, that may be more difficult for them to manage than if they were given instructions that are supported by visual materials, for instance, because that is their strength. The right hemisphere is not been damaged, is intact, so that they can respond and hold on to information more easily using information that can be processed by the right hemisphere, and vice versa. So moving on to the next quiz. This is just consolidation exercise, and for you to look at each statement and determine whether each statement is an example of episodic memory and procedural, whether it's semantic memory, prospective memory, or whether it's an example of working memory. So again, I will keep my eye on the chat, and we'll set a time of 5 minutes just for you to work through this. Now, I'm looking at some of the questions back. Is there an assessment tool that assesses the various types of attention? That's from Jill. And there probably, actually, the best answer to this is some of the common screening tools have attention in them. So for instance, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the part where each letter is read out, B, A, J, J, and the person is instructed to tap the table whenever they hear the letter A, that is an example of a sustained attention test. But in terms of assessment battery, a test of everyday attention certainly is the battery which will test all the different components, all the different types of attention as well. So the elevator test is in there for sustained attention. There is a map exercise for selective attention. And, if we need to go down into that level of detail, certainly these tests are useful. Otherwise, the screening tests are very useful for most purposes. The Oxford Cognitive Screen is another one which actually goes into lateral attention as well, spatial attention with the broken hearts test, which is the test where the person being tested is given a whole sheet with hearts of different sizes, and each heart, and the target hearts are the ones without a gap on the left or the right side, and they are just to put a line through the full hearts. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we come to revising the spatial attention section as well. That's great. Thank you very much for posting your answers onto the chat. And we'll go through these in a second. I think you're pretty spot on with these answers. Okay, last 45 seconds. Okay, everyone, let's come back together. So let's go through these. So talking about your last holiday, episodic memory, things that have happened, events that have happened to us, answering a history question in a quiz, semantic memory, riding your bike on a familiar route, procedural memory, unless of course you're riding it for the first time, and that's something else, performing a complex mental calculation, and working memory, keeping a shopping list in your head before going to the shop, semantic memory, putting everyday clothes on, procedural memory, remembering to keep an appointment with the dentist, prospective memory, keeping a procedure in mind while performing the actions, working memory, and knowing that the capital of Italy is Rome, semantic memory, and remembering your last trip to the supermarket, episodic memory. So hopefully everybody's okay with that. And again, when you think about the people with stroke that you work with, you will see the impacts of memory of people with episodic memory and people where they're not able to remember things that have happened in recent times, people who have semantic memory issues where they're really not processing, not able to take in things that have been the things that have been spoken to them about, and people with working memory that can't coordinate information become very easily overloaded, and people who cannot hold on to the intentions, with regards to prospective memory, and won't undertake any planned actions in the future. One of the things to consider here is that procedural memory tends to be that bit more robust. So some of the practice elements, some of the training elements that it can be useful to do is to train things until they are done procedurally. And an example of that would be, if somebody has a memory issue, one of the key strategies may be to work with them to use a diary or a book where things are written into. Now, the downside of that is that the person has memory issues, so they probably won't remember that they actually have a book to start with. But ongoing work can mean that it becomes a habit, it becomes a part of procedural memory, so the person can actually then undertake the use of a diary and always reach for that diary or the book just out of habit, rather than needing to pull upon their memory. And they're using, drawing upon, and what you're doing is loading upon the procedural memory that they're probably stronger in than episodic memory. Okay, so a little recap on executive function levels. If you recall this diagram, we have a three system example of executive function, where they interact with each other. The lower system is the basic knowledge system. And when I've spoken up till now about things that are done procedurally, more automatically, then we're talking about the system. So an example that I gave in the presentation is driving. For instance, you're driving on the way to work, and you've been driving for years, so you're not really having to think about all the individual bits of control, and you're not really thinking about driving, you're just thinking about getting to work. But if you encounter any difficulties, then you still remain safe, because your executive function system, this middle system, will come into action and be able to perform organization, monitoring, judgment types of tasks. But that's not where it ends. We're not robotic in that nature. So depending on how we're feeling on that day, what our values are, then our self-reflectiveness part of executive function can influence the decisions that our executive functions make. And just looking at the basic knowledge system and executive function system, when I go back to that discussion about, say, somebody having divided attention, it's probably most effective if somebody's dividing their attention between something that is functioning within the basic knowledge system and something else which is functioning within the executive function system. If somebody is doing two or more things that require this conscious executive function system, then that is going to be a lot more difficult than if something is within the basic knowledge system. So hopefully you'll find that executive function model useful for going on, particularly for describing and reinforcing that we operate in a more, sometimes in a more automatic mode, and sometimes we're in that more deliberate conscious mode. The more automatic mode being the basic knowledge system, and the more conscious deliberate mode being the executive function system. Okay, so again, now this is a quicker one. I think you'll be able to do this in, let's give 3 minutes for this, if you don't mind. And really just to look at the statements and determine whether each statement would be a routine type of task, or whether it requires executive function. And yeah, so let's spend 3 minutes on this.
There's a question from Cindy in the chat while we're doing the quiz.
Okay, let me pull that up. Yeah, so Cindy's asked, what is the difference between semantic memory versus phonological memory? Now you've got in brackets working memory. So this is the phonological loop regarding the left hemisphere. What I would say with that is that, you know, they're kind of both interrelated. The left hemisphere is responsible for processing a lot of that language information, and that language information is going to be processed through reading or through verbalization. So the model itself is a very simplification of the mechanisms that relate our left hemisphere of the brain to language-based mechanisms. Yeah, does that answer your question at all, Cindy? Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yeah, so I guess to say a little bit more about that phonological memory, rather than phonological memory, it's just, what it is just really a model and a concept called the phonological loop, which provides a picture of that piece of recording tape. Then the main thing to take out of that is it's information that is just held there temporarily and while we need it, like the example I gave in the presentation about using a telephone number that somebody's told you. As soon as you've used that telephone number, you will probably not have held on to that number. Okay, that's our 3 minutes. So if we go through these now. So walking along a familiar level pathway, of course, a routine function, getting dressed in a new jacket with several buttons and buckle, probably require executive function level, preparing tea in an unfamiliar kitchen, executive, putting an old pair of pajamas on, routine, chairing a meeting for the first time at work, executive, preparing dinner for friends using a new recipe, executive, working out why a new TV sound system is not working, executive. And I have had the comment before that working out why your existing TV sound system is not working requires a lot of executive function too. And walking along a familiar but icy pathway, executive, driving home using a familiar route after work, routine, and getting dressed for the first time after a shoulder injury, executive. And you can probably see the implications of that, where, for instance, somebody would be dressing routinely before stroke. And now that the stroke has left them with a right-sided weakness, it has now become a task that requires executive function. Okay. And again, the table summary of executive function, and this was part of my work concept. It was distilling the executive function into 5 building blocks, and each of these building blocks have their own theory base. And concept formation, which in essence is understanding the situation, planning to be able to choose strategies working towards certain goals, and also to keep goals in mind as well, goal maintenance and self-regulation, making these changes and little changes in sub-goals, etc., while you're actually involved in a task. initiation, and this was initiation related to executive function and not so much related to, say, a lack of motivation or a lack of interest or not understanding a situation. It is best described as somebody who knows what they want to do, wishes to do this thing, but just can't seem to start the task that they want to do, and unless they're cued. And inhibition, choosing to discontinue a response which is no longer relevant, stopping prepotent responses, the prepotent response being defined by something that is very well learned or overlearned that we tend to do almost automatically, that when it's not effective, we need to consciously inhibit and stop that response. So for instance, somebody we're working with has always been used to stepping up on the first step of their stairs with their right foot, but now their right foot is weak from the stroke and they're having to step with their left foot. Then they may have to deliberately use inhibition to stop themselves stepping up with that right foot. Stopping responses to relevant stimuli and removing irrelevant information from working memories so they're not unnecessarily overloaded or responding to everything that's coming along, which can result from a problem with inhibition. And flexibility, the ability to move between ideas or actions, and a couple of different types, where reactive flexibility is somebody being able to switch between different tasks and ideas when they are cued to do so. But spontaneous flexibility is the action of actually deliberately choosing, drawing upon more executive function in order to deliberately undertake that task. So here are the scenarios, again, as a consolidation exercise. And if we take a few minutes to do these, I'll talk through them first of all, and then I'll leave you a set amount of time just to think through these and determine which component each person is having difficulty with. So I have now, apologies, these are not stroke examples, but they are based on real examples that I've worked with and encountered. So we'll have Dorothy observed to not follow a program of activities. She'd worked with the occupational therapist on developing the program, seemed motivated, no problems, but when left to undertake
Charlie, you've gone on mute for about 30
Oh,
seconds.
how strange. Yes, I'm not sure what happened there. I think I must have hit something. Yeah,
I
so
thought we were
yeah.
just thinking, but no.
Not yet. Yeah, not yet. Apologies for that. Yeah, hopefully you can hear me again. And actually, all I was doing was just reading out the scenario with Peter. And the key thing is that he'd been having dressing practice and things seemed to be okay. But at home, his family found him only half dressed. And he told them that he was trying to put his clothes on, but just couldn't get his head around what he should do first and then what he should do next. Here's Joan, who has returned to work, but there is an element of her work where she's getting caught up in things. Everything seems to be done at an intense speed. She's in a hurry, and the quality of her cleaning is very poor as a result. And she's getting caught up in everything when she's moving between the different office rooms. And Beverly, who is in the kitchen for the first time after a left partial anterior stroke, and during her assessment of preparing an omelette, she required prompts on 2 occasions, once to move from beating the eggs, and the second to turn the gas off and serve the omelette onto the plate. So the key thing here is she just seems to be getting stuck on each of the tasks unless given a cue in order to move her from one task to another. And finally, we'll have 60-year-old Michael with an anoxic brain injury and fully dependent for all personal care, so very severe brain injury. And although he would open his eyes and follow people moving and say occasional appropriate phrases, it just was uncertain what his level of cognition was. So what is being illustrated there? Okay, so would you like to, you've probably answered these already, but would you like to take looking at the time here, yeah, just 5 minutes, I think, would do that. And if anybody needs more time, we can increase that, but I reckon that you've probably got a good idea of this already. I've just opened up the chat there. Yeah, apologies that the sound just seemed to click off there. Yeah, question there from Winnie. I think you're absolutely right there. Yeah, stopping the loop of actions, and also if it's just one action, to be able to stop that. And flexibility is about shifting from one thing to another. And you probably realize that flexibility is very interlinked with inhibition and initiation. Question here from Claudia. Would you say that most cooking assessments done in hospital require more executive functions than when the person is cooking in their own kitchen, and therefore not always predictive of somebody's independence for cooking a meal prep when discharged home? Oh, that's such a good point. And it works both ways, because it's an unfamiliar setting, it is loading more on somebody. So somebody may do better when they're in their own familiar environment. But if you want to use an assessment which represents how somebody will respond to novel situations and problem solve, for instance, then actually doing it in an unfamiliar setting provides a lot of information as well in terms of how somebody may be able to undertake unfamiliar tasks and how they problem solve. Now, that's a very useful comment. You're very welcome, Claudia. Okay, last minute. Okay, let's come back together again. Hopefully that was reasonably straightforward for you. And again, I reinforce the point that it is artificial to separate these different components out. And of course, many of these will draw upon two or more of these executive function components. But for illustrative purposes, we'll go through these 5 scenarios. You probably guessed that there is one of the components for each of the scenarios. So here's Dorothy. She's observed by occupational therapists to not follow a program of activities, but she'd worked on developing the program. So she'd been involved and seemed to be motivated, but when left to undertake the task, failed to get started. And of course, it seems to be an initiation problem. Initiation, for those of you that work within hospitals or institutional settings, it is notoriously difficult to assess initiation because generally people are cued, even inadvertently, into doing tasks. So in the morning, washing and dressing, lights will come on, the whole ward environment will start to get going again, which in a way acts as a cue. Or staff will bring washing implements, etc., to the person. So in order to get a sense of somebody's initiation, it is worthwhile setting up some tasks that are perhaps scheduled a little bit into the future to see if somebody is able to initiate these tasks. Otherwise, people can go home without actually really knowing, and without us knowing whether they can initiate tasks or not. And then we'll have Peter, who did return home and seemed to have gotten stuck with his dressing. And a planning issue here. So as an example of when left his own devices, he's not able, he has an uncertainty about what stage of the task he's moving on to doing next. And here is Joan. Again, that characteristic of being in a hurry and responding to everything that's there, taking too long in one area because of getting caught up, and certainly an example of a problem with inhibition. And I always remember, one gentleman that I worked with, and his main goal was to get back to driving again. And when first meeting him, my thought was, well, what is the problem? He was already cycling 40 miles a day. He had no weakness from the stroke, but there was just and nobody had really explored to see whether he'd go back to driving or not. And so I administered one of the driving assessments, the Rookwood driving assessments, one of the cognitive assessments. And it was interesting because he passed it all, but one task, which was to look at two-dimensional drawings of cubes and to be able to count the number of cubes that are in each diagram, he made 2 mistakes, still passed, but the way in which he did it in this very hurried, intense way meant that these mistakes could have been avoided because he certainly had the ability. And he observed himself that he had prepared 2 cups of coffee and hadn't dried the mugs properly, etc. So it just all pointed towards him having difficulty inhibiting his actions, inhibiting the way he was taking things on. And out of interest, actually, I asked him in terms of his time perception as well, if he could recite the alphabet for me, but recite it and try to fill 1 minute with the alphabet. And he did this. He recited the alphabet, and I asked him, how long did you think he took to recite the alphabet? And he says, I think I was close to the minute. And I timed him, and I says, you took 12 seconds to do the alphabet. So it was a real indication about, how, he felt this this drive and not able to kind of hold himself back. And it was interesting that he already had an on-road driving assessment planned, and he went on to fail that assessment. But an even more interesting thing was, and it was unfortunate that his wife hadn't told me at the time, she said to me after that he'd always had a problem with inhibiting, and it led him to have accidents in the past with his car. So it was a very interesting situation. But I always picture him when thinking about inhibition as with the characteristics that certainly Joan has. And here's Beverly, and she's in the kitchen and pretty much having difficulty from moving from one part of the task to the other part, illustrating a problem with flexibility. And then we'll have Michael, and of course the one that's left, and the big question mark is over what is his concept formation. What is his actual understanding of things? And in the end, it appeared that Michael didn't really have much of an understanding of what was going around, but the very sensible statements that he was verbalizing were almost routine statements that he would just come out with, that were in response to things said, but without much of a level of cognition behind them, like automatic phrases that you would actually say. Okay, so hopefully that you were okay with determining which component was which there, albeit it was a little bit artificial. And if we move on to this breakout session before we take a break. So we have Tom, and he is working in his first physical therapy session in the gym. When the physical therapist explains the plan for the session, Tom looks around the gym and is drawn to any sounds or movements that are happening elsewhere. Okay, so the question here is, which cognitive domain is affected, between attention, what type of attention, or is it memory, or is it an executive function thing? And thinking about, regardless of what profession you're in, how would you try to reduce the impact of what is going on with Tom? Then we have Mary, and Mary's at home, and speech language pathologist is working with her on object naming exercise. Session works out fine, but on the next visit it becomes apparent that Mary has no recollection of what they had discussed, despite being able to provide details of the previous session. So that was the confusing thing. No recollection of what had been discussed, but was actually able to recall much of what happened during the previous session. So again, what cognitive domain is affected here, and how would you address it? How would you reduce the impact of it? And third scenario is Christina, and she's preparing soup. She chops the vegetables and continues to do this even though she'd already described how she was going to prepare a pot with stock. And so what cognitive domain is affected here, and how would you reduce the impact of this? I'm just reading that again, actually. This actually makes sense. Christina's preparing soup in the occupational energy, chops the vegetables and continues to do. Yes, that's right. So just to make that absolutely clear, she'd already described what she was going to do, which represented she knows what she's doing, but when she's chopping the vegetables, she just seems to carry on and on without stopping. Okay. So I think now a time for this, for you to look through these scenarios. We want to take a break soon as well, around about now. I was thinking about a break. So if you want to start thinking about this for the next 5 minutes until 20 past, and then take a break and then come back and come back at 22, and I'll reintroduce the session again and take another 10 minutes to work through the other two scenarios, and then we'll come back altogether at about 10 minutes to the hour, if that's okay with everyone. And I'll just keep online for any questions coming through.
So we're all back together at 10:50?
Yes,
Okay.
and that includes working on this, getting answers, and then and then taking a 20-minute break in the middle of this.
Great. I'm going to pause the recording while we're thinking and breaking.
Sure. Okay, hi everyone. Hope you've all had a good break, and hopefully you took a break. We're just still within that 10-minute period left for you to work on the scenarios, but just really some interesting questions and conversations that are coming through here. Apologies to the people who was actually typing responses, but it's just gone to Barb and I, so you won't have seen these responses. So I will talk through them, and I'm just going to go back, and it was I'm looking at the part where I lost my sound, and then Winnie has made a comment about inhibition, more about stopping the loop of actions, and flexibility is about when to start and stop, change the task, and that certainly is the case. And the test, what test is the cube counting test? And I've given the description of that. There is, I think it's a UK test, but it's the Rookwood driving battery, and it uses some of the behavioural assessment of this executive syndrome test as well. And cube counting, there are around 10 picture line drawings of a number of cubes placed beside each other and sometimes stacked on top of each other. And what the person being tested is asked to do is to determine the number of cubes which are in the picture. So one of the early pictures has just 3 cubes side by side, and so it's quite an easy one where the person will usually get 3, the correct response, whereas some of the ones that have up to 10 cubes, there are some stacked, there are some in the corner, so not all cubes are visible, and the person is to make a determination of how many cubes would actually all be included there, including the ones that are underneath other cubes or behind other cubes. And then we went on to a conversation about, the inhibition challenges the same as impulsivity. It's a really interesting question, actually, because when we do see people, when I see people who have a difficulty with inhibition, it can appear as if somebody's impulsive. But when looking at what impulsivity is, it can be as a result of anxiety or somebody excited, somebody being determined. It can also be an inherent part of someone's personality where somebody just does things for no reasons. And so in that sense, they're probably not exactly the same. But to say that inhibition problems can sometimes feel or appear as impulsivity. And I've gone on to say that the gentleman who I gave the example of in relation to the driving, because there were elements of things before the stroke, I do wonder whether the elements of both there was some stroke related elements which had made his presentation probably a bit worse, but also there were things that he was doing in terms of impulsivity from before the stroke. And then went on to talk about perseveration, and sort of is an antiquated term, and referring to inhibition difficulties as perseveration. And certainly what I've said is perseveration, in my experience, still a widely used term, means very useful describing the difficulty of not stopping an action, and most likely describing the mechanism of reduced inhibition or flexibility. And I've provided a bit of information that there is a theory that the presentation of reduced inhibition actually isn't a thing. It doesn't exist, but instead is related to waning working memory, where somebody's actually lost track of what they're doing. And for example, someone losing track and just continuing the current action as a result. The example I can think of there is in clock drawing. I don't know if any of you have ever had an example or seen the result of a clock drawing test where somebody has done the circle and then they've put the numbers on, and they 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they just 13, 14, 15, 16, and they're not doing military time. They just appear to have lost track of what they're doing, and they're just actually writing down just a whole sequences of numbers, sometimes into the 30s, before they stop, or I've had to stop them. So it was an interesting conversation with that. And also the comment is perseveration, is it just flexibility? And at that, I did have a look just online quickly at a definition for perseveration, and perseveration seemed to include both elements of the difficulty of switching from one thing to another, but also the difficulty of stopping prepotent responses as well, which is certainly in the definitions that I know of a lack of inhibition. Preferred to have been asked by Shonika, do you have preferred assessment for executive function? And I'll read this out actually because I've done quite a lengthy response to this. So preferred assessment for executive function. And I always regard this in a couple of different levels. So for screening, which quicker, initial things to get the feel of how somebody is, I'd use the Oxford Cognitive Screen in clinic. The trail making sessions are particularly useful because they are set up by giving demonstrations before each one. But of course that's restricted to more kind of working memory, and there's an element of planning there. So for more in-depth assessment, behavioural assessment of this executive syndrome, and because the tests in that battery include things like 6 elements, which test flexibility and planning and strategy formation using key search and zoom app tests. However, some of the more practical tests that I know about are things like multiple errands, which actually requires people to go ahead and plan and do actual real life tasks. And I've said in the end, I use some screening. I like to set up and observe tasks which require application of executive function that are related to the person's goals and what they wish to work towards. And that's certainly where task analysis comes into its own. And can you please spell out the name of the driving? Yeah, so it's ROOKWOOD, and Rookwood Driving Assessment Battery. In the now, apologies, I've not had a chance to look at what the Canadian recommendations are, but in the UK recommendations, which are a few years old now, the stroke drivers screening assessment is one of the recommended tests. In fact, I did one this morning with somebody because it's probably got the greatest validity and reliability, and the normative data had been taken from people who were heading towards an on-road test. So there is a rating that if somebody passes that test, they are 80% likely to pass an on-road test. So it's the reason why it's in guidelines. But the test does have some weaknesses because it's set up so that people have to respond to 2 different arrow directions. It's actually hard to describe it, so I won't try just now to describe what that test is like. But some people just do not understand what they're meant to do with the test. So the developers have always said that if somebody passes the test, they are 80% likely to pass an on-road test. If they do not pass the test, that does not mean to say that they don't have the driving ability, only that they should be assessed in some other way. And I think that's in recognition that some of the parts of the test are kind of abstract, and when people don't understand them and they don't pass the test, it's not a reflection on their ability, only their understanding of what they were meant to do in that test. Hopefully that information's okay. All right, and I'm just going to do one final look up to see if there's any other comments. Now, I did respond to Claudia's one, didn't I? In terms of the cooking assessments done in the hospital require more executive function. Yeah, I think I spoke that one out, and it was very much a case of, yes, anything in an unfamiliar location will load on executive functions more than when somebody is in their own kitchen. But then sometimes that has its uses, because when assessing somebody's routine task performance, it may not give us an idea of how they are when they face novel tasks, or when they face something which is a bit more complex, which they then have to problem solve that task. And that's certainly what our clinic locations and hospital kitchens, etc., can give us. Right, a question from Laurie. How are we able to obtain a copy of the Broken Heart Screening Tool and the Oxford Cognitive Screen in Canada? It is possible. When I did the workshops in Canada over the last couple of years, there is a link that I will actually share with Barb, who can get it out with people who want it. For non public places, and I'm not sure about the international places, there is a payment that's required for the Oxford Cognitive Screen. It's not much, and the tool is just downloadable actually from the website, from the Oxford University website. Unfortunately, they changed their name recently, but I'll pass that on. I'll pass the link on. The name was previously ISIS, and it was all about unfortunate. And I think ISIS is one of the rivers that go through Oxford, which is why it was called that. But for obvious reasons, they needed to change it. So, but I'll share that link, and I'll make a note of that just now. Okay, so again, hope everybody was able to have a good break and for ready to look at these scenarios. While I go through this, please feel free just to post anything on chat as well in terms of your ideas or any questions. So we'll have Tom, who's in his physical therapy session in the gym, and when the physical therapist explains the plan for the session, Tom looks around the gym and is drawn to sounds or movements that are happening elsewhere. So which cognitive domain is affected? And he probably has a bit of a selective attention issue, and there's probably an element where his inhibition is affected as well, because he's getting drawn off to various sounds. He's being distracted. He's not able to actually selectively attend to the physical therapist. And again, please post anything if you have anything else there that you wish to discuss. So how would you reduce the impact of this? First thing, as a suggestion, is engage with Tom in a quiet location so that his attention can be optimized, and a quiet location with no distractions. Converse with Tom to understand what he is experiencing. This is probably a common one for all these scenarios, in that we can learn only so much by observing how somebody is, but if somebody is able to converse, to be able to achieve that understanding of what their experience is, because what we're observing may be completely different from what the person is actually experiencing. Agree best methods for sharing information on session. So for instance, does Tom need a great deal of simplification? Does he need this information provided in a very quiet environment with very little visually around him? Does he need visual information in addition to text and verbal information? And that is best done in conjunction with Tom, if Tom is able to consider and come to what might suit him best. And given some examples there: simple format, printed information, bold language and pictures, and encourage interaction during information sharing to draw on reactive flexibility. Now, what I'll decipher that statement. What that means is, rather than just talking at Tom or providing information to Tom, which he is probably going to find challenging if he does have a selective attention problem or a lack of inhibition, it is probably useful to be more interactive with Tom and get him to, explain his understanding of things, asking him of suggestions, because it does look like that one of his strengths is reactive flexibility, because he's getting pulled off on different stimuli. So you perhaps try to use that to our advantage of involving him actively within the information giving. Okay, so I'm just going to check for any chat comments. No, okay, everybody okay with that? So here's Mary working with speech and language pathologist, and object naming, session works out fine. On the next week, Mary seems to have a memory of what happened in the session, but has no recollection of what was discussed. So it does look like semantic memory is certainly affected here. And incidentally, it's such a common thing, and I'm sure the speech and language pathologists, will be able to tell you about this. That even when somebody is reasonably fluent with their speech, can find words, the aphasia doesn't seem to be evident or minimal, their actual processing and recall of language-based information can still be effective. So when somebody in your team is saying that this particular cognitive screening is scored a lot lower than what you would have expected because the person's functioning fine. Certainly one of the first questions that I ask is, has the stroke affected the left hemisphere? And, is it affecting language? Because many of our screening tools are very loaded on language, very language dependent. So that's when sometimes the scores on these tools do not represent the ability of the person. So how would we reduce the impact of this? Okay. One way to check Mary's experience of retaining information from other conversations. So is it just this particular session, or when with other people who know Mary, experienced family members, etc. Is she picking up on what they're saying and retaining it, or is it difficult in every situation? So that'll help confirm your theories. Provide information on memory, including the process of memory. Now, you recall that as well as the diagram we had for semantic memory and episodic memory, there was also the process of memory, which usefully describes memory as the process of having an attention on the information, then being able to encode the information. So the information must be understandable, and it must be of a quantity that can be processed, not too much. It can't become too fast to somebody to stop them being able to process. So are all these conditions right for the information coming to the person? Then it's stored, but only in the short-term store, only kind of in working memory, unless it's consolidated. And consolidation is the act of thinking through the information again, playing around with the information, associating the information to set up more and more pathways in which to help to retrieve that information. So that's the process. And finally, it leads on to the recall of that information. So based on that, the third point is optimizing attention on the information and encoding of information by adapting the materials to match Mary's ability. So perhaps there's more in the way of reducing the amount that's on the page. That's always the classic one. Sometimes people struggle when there's so much on a page, reduce it to one thing on a page, and that can make a difference to how somebody responds and is able to identify correctly to what is on the page, and provide opportunities for Mary to consolidate the verbal information, particularly because episodically she seems to be okay, and use strategy of backing up verbal information with written or printed information and pictures. And you remember the diagram with working memory and drawing upon somebody's strengths. If somebody's had a right hemisphere stroke, then perhaps use more language information. If visual processing and spatial attention is affected, and if somebody's had a left hemisphere stroke, then perhaps use more visual information because the language processing abilities may have changed. Okay, I'll just pause now. A couple of comments coming in here. So the driving battery, should we provide a recap of the last session for Mary? Oh, you know, I'm not quite sure. Oh, I understand that. I was thinking about the presentation there. Yeah, certainly that would be the case, because we don't want to leave Mary without the information, you know, from the last session. So certainly providing a recap, but providing a recap actually using some of the methods that we've come down, just to see if that information stays with Mary a little bit more. But certainly that's essential to do, to provide a recap, because she's, in effect, she's maybe missed some of this information from the last session. And a question from Krista, any assessment or screening tools that are not language based to get a better picture of the patient? What is nice here, the Oxford Cognitive Screen, the reason why I certainly use it is probably one of the most language or aphasia friendly tools, because apart from a picture naming test at the beginning, the rest of the test has visual options for people to point to. So some people can't say the information, but they can read and recognize certain words for the memory exercise and the orientation exercise tests that are involved in there. So it is very language aphasia friendly, so I would certainly recommend that one. Apart from that, it may be a case of looking through certain batteries, and some of them will require language, some of them tend not to require language, but those tests that are more practical in nature certainly are the ones that are easiest to administer and for people to process. But that's not to say that they don't have difficulty processing the instructions. So the ones where the instructions are demonstrated can be useful. So a contrasting example from that is, for those of you that have seen Montreal Cognitive Assessment, you know that the very first test is a trail making test, and it is given verbally. So it's like starting from the first number, I want you to draw a line to the next letter, and then to the next number, next letter, and so on and so forth until you reach the end. Now that's quite a very abstract, complex verbal instruction to give, and also the person hasn't warmed up, so they're right into this trail making task. Whereas in the Oxford Cognitive Screen, every element of the trail making has a demonstration at the start of it, where the person can do it themselves and receive feedback, or the therapist can actually demonstrate the drawing as well for the person before they actually undertake the test. So it's completely clear what the person's meant to do. So thank you for that. And how would you help Mary consolidate the information? Different ways, depending on what the information is. And I'll give you an example. Apologies, I do not remember whether I gave this example. I think I did in the presentation. And any ways in which the information can be thought about, you know, as a good way to consolidate. And again, it depends on what type of information was given. But talking through it again, giving examples. The gentleman I mentioned was the gentleman with the temporal lobe stroke, and every day in the acute stroke unit, he thought he was in another location, and he had no recall of events and before, so it was a real significant episodic memory issue. So one of the goals was for him to know where he was in that hospital. So we would start off consistently with each session, same questions, and then to reinforce his location, we would go to the window and we would look at the skyline of the town. We would talk about when the last time he was in the town. We would talk about, did he ever do any work there? How would he drive into the town? Also, did he have anybody that he knew that stayed there? So all this was a means of just trying to get him to form the information in as many different ways as possible. And similarly, in terms of Mary, the information that had been given verbally because it was part of a discussion, could any of that have been done in pictures? If Mary is able to read, you know, could it be printed, and could she be instructed to look at it? Is there a family member that could be there to run things by Mary, you know, on a daily basis, so that the information, so that there is almost like a program and a scheduled time when Mary is looking at this information again. So in short, any ways that the information can be addressed in different ways can be useful to build up the number of pathways where Mary is able to to um, access the information. And I see a comment here from is Mary a patient that you would use a journal with to help to retain information? Very possibly, yes. And again, thinking about the nature of procedural memory and episodic memory, it may be that she has difficulty in remembering that she has a journal, but at the same time, there's a strength there, isn't there, in that her episodic memory seems to be okay, because she was able to recall things that had happened in the session. She just couldn't recall the verbal information. So certainly a journal, if she's able to read and write, you know, would be another means of consolidating that information. It brings up another example, actually. There was the lady with it was a subdural hematoma, left hemisphere, and she not only had problems with memory, she could not place memories in time. So her sister might have visited yesterday, but she thought it was 6 months before. And something that happened 6 months before, she might think it was yesterday. So she was actually using a diary. She was at home and she was recording into a journal. But the problem was, in my next visit, I turned up and it all been completed, but I realized that it had actually been the family who'd completed it. And well-meaning, being a very supportive family. And what I explained to them was the act of recording in that diary journal was an act of consolidation, because it would mean that she would have to think through the event to record it and get it in there, and the time it takes to actually record a bit of information, she's thinking about it constantly that time, to give the biggest opportunity for that to be laid down as a memory. So certainly, you know, a journal and the word of caution, you know, for Mary to actually complete the journal rather than be assisted by well-meaning family members or friends who would enter into the journal for her. Now, the question for Mark: at the Ottawa Hospital and many other hospitals in Ontario, patients have access to my chart, which allows them to access summary of their visit. That sounds good. Along with any recommendations or homework to do prior to the next appointment. This can be a useful tool which would allow the patient to refer back to this institution. That's great. Thank you very much for that, Mark. I think that's a great suggestion. And also, it has the advantage that it looks like it's accessible to the whole team as well. So the whole team can provide this culture and this mechanism of people checking back of what they're going to be doing and helping to reinforce that as well. Thank you very much. I think I'll look to introduce something like that into our services. I think I'm just looking back now and just hoping everything's covered there. And that's great. Thank you everybody for that. Okay, and then we're on to Christina. Is preparing soup in the occupational therapy kitchen. She chops the vegetables and continues to do this, even though she had already described how she was going to prepare a pot with stock. Now, the reason why I paused over this was when I read that, I thought, oh, what's the problem here? But then I realized I hadn't emphasized it, just keeps on doing it. And on the back of our the questions and comments about perseveration and about flexibility and inhibition, this is particularly relevant. So inhibition, flexibility, that's what it appears like. And if you note, a few of the examples have this describing how she was going to prepare a pot with stock. If people are able to, it's very useful to engage them in conversation, because it's a way of checking that they actually have concept formation and an understanding of the task in hand, so that you know when they run into difficulties, it's not a problem with understanding. Christina had already demonstrated that she understood what she was meant to be doing. And so when she just came to just continuing chopping and chopping and chopping, you know that you already know that her understanding is there. Let's see another chat comment coming in. Would there also be some inhibition as well? Now, Cindy, do you mean with this current scenario or the previous scenario? Or this scenario? Yep. Yeah, certainly. So, so the two that I've got there is, inhibition and flexibility, because she doesn't seem to, she's not inhibiting what may be a prepotent response. She's gotten into this element of just chopping, and she just doesn't seem to be able to move off it. And also thinking about that little conversation about waning working memory, that's another element there as well. Depending on how Christina had been with other tasks, you would probably know this by this stage in how we're working. Is Christina somebody who loses track of what she's doing? And if she loses track of other things, then it's possible that actually she's chopping and gone into a zone where she's just lost track of what she's doing. So that's certainly a third consideration there of waning working memory as contributing to an inhibition presentation. Oh, sorry, I meant to say initiation. Actually, it's a good point, because flexibility is, can be seen as a form of inhibition and initiation, although it can sometimes be different. So somebody initiating from doing nothing, it might feel different from somebody who's already in action, already initiated, and just needs to switch that action. So, but certainly there may be an issue there, and that issue would be determined on whether Christina needed a cue to start this task, or whether she was cued by staff in the occupational therapy kitchen. And that's where sometimes we have to be cunning in setting up things where we're not cueing somebody to start things. And one of the most straightforward ways of doing that is scheduling something just a little bit in the future to see if they will start that. Of course, it depends on their ability, their prospective memory ability, because if somebody doesn't have prospective memory, or it's impaired, then you could say that they're not going to initiate anyway, and it's nothing to do with their initiation ability. They have just forgotten to start that task. So if somebody does have that ability for prospective memory, and it doesn't mean setting an alert, because that alert is actually a strategy and a cue for somebody to initiate. So, but it is setting up something. And in terms of grading an initiation type of intervention, it can be useful to start off with an initiation of a task which is maybe about 10 minutes into the future, and then it can be upgraded to something that's they're going to agree to initiate the next day, for instance. Okay, so thank you for that. Let me just check on any more comments. If a task that she's done familiar, could procedural memory also be affected? That's an interesting question, because Christina is somebody who has cooked before. This is not an unfamiliar task for her, and generally her procedural memory is something that is there, so she can do these things without thinking about them. Does procedure does it include, I suppose the question is, how much of the task does that include? So is procedural memory enough to take her through the chopping and emptying into the pot? But in this case, she is just chopping and she's not taking the next stage up to empty into the pot. So there is an argument that, perhaps procedural memory is also affected, but also maybe not, if procedural memory is only that element of the task where she's chopping and not including the change, the transition to the other aspects of the task? It's a really interesting question, that, Jodie, actually. In general terms, procedural memory is usually still there if somebody has the physical and sensory ability and visual ability to still undertake the task in the same way. So is less prone to disruption from cognitive impairment than what more executive-based tasks are, unless, of course, somebody has got quite significant attentional issues, for instance, and in the middle of a task that they know very well, any little thing happening in the room can pull their attention away from the task. But in that way, the procedural memory is still there. It's just that it's been the attention that's the problem there. Thank you for your interesting comments and questions. So how would you reduce the impact of this? Again, the conversation with Christina to explore what she's experiencing. How does she think she's doing? Does she say, I'm doing fine? Or does she actually say that, I'm just chopping here and I'm not sure what to do next? Or does she say that, I'm chopping and I know I need to get these vegetables into the pot, but for some reason I just cannot change to that action of doing it? And more than likely, the response for many people is, it's just really strange and I don't know what's happening. So more often than not, people aren't able to give a critique and an analysis in that level of detail. Check working memory ability for goal maintenance. I'd made mention of that. Is she just losing track? Inhibition and flexibility are very abstract concepts, and use of examples can enhance shared understanding. And what I mean by that is, I guess if I try to explain inhibition and flexibility as I have done during this workshop, that's going to lose people. So the use of examples of somebody, for instance, filling the fridge, and then they have the phone in their hand. I think it was an example used during the presentation, and they then put the phone in the fridge. Then I think people can relate to that. Driving back to your old house when you've recently moved home, for instance, is another example when you've just been in automatic mode and you've not inhibited. An example of where perhaps working memory or memory process become involved in that. And flexibility, where again, examples of that in practical tasks are people that get caught up in doing a certain puzzle and not able to move off that puzzle, or just anything concrete that can be used to give an example to explain these abstract concepts. Try external strategies such as alerts to cue task shifting. And this applies to initiation as well, and sometimes inhibition on its own. I'm working with a lady at the moment. We're using the now I'm trying to remember the actual title, not the brand name, of the Echo Dot and the Amazon Alexa, but she's in a care home. The device is being used because she does not have the ability to switch a TV on or to do puzzles that she loves doing, and because she has no initiation, she will just sit until somebody comes into the room or initiates something with her. So we tried it with a phone alert first of all, and in the middle of us actually undertaking a task, her first task was to switch the TV on when the alert on the phone went off. And so we went into it, and she was playing the dominoes, the alert went off, and she switched the TV on. So that gave the potential for this to be used. And in the last session, I worked with family for them to set up scheduled prompts coming from the Echo Dot device, which is in a room. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops, particularly when there is nobody in the room and she is there by herself. With us being there, did we provide an inadvertent cue for what we were doing? So that's the next part of the test, which involves some of the care home staff as well. And now, no, Jodie was the one who answered. Mariev, curious how to distinguish the difficulty to initiate the next step in a sequencing task versus limopraxia. The apraxia word, yes. Definitely we'll come to talk about that as well, because sometimes it is difficult to determine whether it's an apraxia or whether it's a flexibility issue, and sometimes that can be informed just through the tests of apraxia, and also the nature of the stroke, where the brain has been damaged, to find out whether an apraxia is present or not. And if it is present, then that's when there might be a difficulty in actually determining the two apart, which would need to take a look at in different types of tasks. And I'm wondering how much to say about this just now. No, let's just carry on. And bearing in mind that apraxia can affect people's purposeful selection of movements, but not so much when things are routine. So somebody with apraxia is working on a task, the likelihood, and again, not always, and the likelihood is that if they are using their procedural memory and working procedurally, they probably aren't going to maybe have too much of a problem moving between one step to the next. Whereas if it's a very deliberate novel task, and again, this is an unfamiliar OT kitchen, perhaps apraxia is going to affect that. So it's looking at the different elements or the different effects of apraxia or executive functions flexibility, and seeing how consistent they are with other tasks in order to make a determination of what is at play during this particular task. But thank you very much for that. That's a great point, and actually introduces the apraxia thing really well as we go into these next scenarios. Okay, and self-talk strategies. That's important because if the limit are external alerts, these are not always going to be available in all areas. So for instance, the whole Amazon device, Alexa device, can't be used in the communal area within the home. So the self-talk strategies, counting strategies, etc., to self-cue, it may be something that Christina can use and set up tasks and actually practice task shifting, for Christina to practice inhibition, type of thing you might set up in a workshop or a clinic room where there's 3 activities and Christina is given 2 minutes to undertake parts of 3 activities, and sort of our goal is to do a part of each activity within that 3 minutes so that she can drive these task shifting flexibility tasks by herself. Okay, so that is Christina, end of the third scenario, to illustrate real life type situations in your clinical areas as to how these might impact. Now, use the term reactive flexibility and spontaneous flexibility. These reactive and spontaneous also exists for other concepts too that therapists could tap into strategies. I wonder, I suppose, yes, I suppose there's a simple answer to that in terms of, if you think back to the executive function model, which has the 3 components to it, has the 3 parts of the framework, and reactive flexibility could almost be seen to be based in that lower system where the person's not really had to apply executive function or not able to apply executive function to switch task or to do something. And then the executive function is that spontaneous flexibility where the person has made a decision as part of a task to switch between one idea to the other or one task to another. So in fact, it's a thread that goes through when you did the quiz on whether something's routine or whether it requires executive function. It's a similar, it's drawn upon the similar theory as well, that sometimes we operate automatically and sometimes we operate very purposefully using executive function, but many of our tasks will use both automatic selection of actions and spontaneous deliberate actions. That I'll give an example of that. Say for instance you're dressing and you've had your shoulder injury, and so the technique for putting a top on, which is requiring a bit of executive function because things are getting a bit caught and stuck. But then you drop the garment onto your lap and need to pick it up again. The actions probably from dropping with your non-injured side and picking up again isn't something that you probably have to think a lot about. It's an action selected from a routine function called contention scheduling. So in a way, even during the task concurrently, we're using deliberate actions and selecting routine actions which are automatically happening as well. Sarah, I do hope that answers the question there in terms of this is a thread that runs through everything. If coming away from stroke and brain injury for a minute, we know that people with dementia, for instance, can often work and do things just procedurally. Whereas when we ask them to do something, because it's been processed through their executive system, which is damaged by the dementia, they can't do it. So some of the work that's involved with people with dementia, there is a technique called home-based memory rehabilitation, which is work when people that are at the earlier stage of dementia, in order to work with them to apply various strategies, household strategies, that as the dementia progresses, it will then, because of practice, is now in procedural memory, that the person then continues to actually uh, perform these actions and strategies on a more routine basis. So what's happened there is that it started off in that middle executive system, but through practice is then gone into that routine system, which is more robust and less prone to be affected by changes in the brain. And can you give an example of a self-talk strategy? Probably one of the easiest and ones to use are just a very simple word that somebody just hangs on to, and it's the self-talk equivalent of having beeps that just happen every now and again. Because of course, when somebody's in the task, you can't time the beep to be at the same time as when they need to change. There just needs, sometimes it can work where there's just a beep every now and again, and it acts as a cue for something to think, oh, there's that beep, I need to do this. So similarly, that beep isn't always going to be available. So a self-talk strategy can sometimes be a 1, 2, 3. Think of work that you might do with people with Parkinson's disease, for instance, where there is a initiation type of a motor initiation type of thing, where somebody's doing a bit of count or tapping a cane 3 times to actually try to initiate that motor action. It is just anything along these lines of self-talk, where somebody, people who are able to hold on to that in their memory to be able to produce that kind of cueing self-talk. And hopefully that answers the question there, Megan. Okay, no, I'm loving these questions coming in, but I'm just aware of time here. And let's crack on. So this is just the reminder now, moving on to the last scenario question of spatial neglect, and spoke about this a bit earlier on. And just remember that this isn't a visual thing. This is attention, where somebody, at its most severe form, somebody, the part of the world to one side, usually the left side, just does not exist. And then we'll have visual agnosia, usually becomes prevalent when there has been bilateral damage to the brain, or when somebody has had a stroke and then they maybe have a stroke on the other side. Otherwise, when the first stroke has happened, the theories are that the other hemisphere will take up some of that function. So when visual agnosia, the inability to recognize what is being seen, even though the visual mechanisms, the mechanical mechanisms are okay, are associative, and that's related to the pathways from occipital lobe to the temporal lobe, that the person can't put an identifiable label on the object anymore. I can look at my mobile phone, and with associative visual agnosia, I would not know it was a mobile phone, even though I can see it absolutely clearly. Whereas apperceptive visual agnosia is a distortion in the visual image that is being perceived. And then the final bit of recap is on apraxia. and ideational apraxia, sometimes called conceptual apraxia, where somebody has lost the ability or the concept of what movements to do or how to use a tool in a task. So it's that loss of tool knowledge or movement knowledge, and that's related to damage usually to the inferior parietal lobe, whereas ideomotor apraxia is associated with the frontal lobe white connecting structures in the brain. And somebody with ideomotor apraxia knows what they want to do, they have the concept, but they just can't seem to select the right actions or to produce the right actions despite having full motor control. So it's just a brief recap of the two different apraxia types. So over to yourselves for breakout session 3 and consider the scenario and explain how you would address the difficulties that are presented. So here we have Michael, who was recently admitted to hospital after his second stroke. His first stroke was a left partial anterior circulatory stroke 1 year ago, which affected his word finding ability. And he did have a mild right weakness, but his speech and the weakness resolved with a little bit of time, and he was independent again. He got back to his previous functional level. But this time, the CT confirmed a stroke on the other side, a right middle cerebral artery stroke, and he presents with left-sided weakness. He's having difficulty walking, and he's also having difficulty selecting and using items for washing. And he has also lost his word-finding ability. He appears to understand verbal commands by facial expression and nodding, but doesn't seem to be able to execute instructions. So just a thought about which functions may be affected and how would you adapt your therapy approach to optimize his performance in sessions. Now we are at the half hour. Can I get you to just take 10 minutes over this, please? We'll come back together at 11:42. And again, post any things on chat or just, give a thought about, what might be affected and what you would do in your practice to try and address some of these things. Thank you. I must say, I think I've missed something out in the next slide, but I'll add it in when we come back together again. Okay, see you all in 10 minutes. Now, that's a lovely question from Krista. How do you differentiate associative visual agnosia versus apraxia and aphasia? Wonderful, because the three can come along all together, and certainly with people who have come in with second, third strokes, seem to be seeing this more often. So it's useful to break each one down. And now let's just say we have somebody with all three, and we're not sure if they are recognizing things. So one way of recognizing things is the ability to demonstrate the use of something. But if somebody has apraxia, they might not be able to demonstrate. They might not be able to tell us either because of the aphasia. So one of the first things is to try and draw upon a routine, simple task, which is hopefully not affected by the apraxia, because if somebody is having difficulty visually recognizing it because of visual agnosia, when they touch the object, feel and feel it, there's a likelihood that they will actually recognize the object again and be able to do some form of demonstration for it. So that is one way to try and get some clues as to whether it is an agnosia or not. Of course, if it's not an agnosia, and what you can try and do if somebody does have an aphasia and apraxia are just a matching task of matching, a function of something to an object. So if two objects are placed, perhaps a drinking vessel like a mug or a hairbrush, and you have them watch you demonstrate an action for it, and then they're to pick up the object which matches the action, and you do a drinking action, and then and they pick up the mug, that lets you know that they probably don't have an associative visual agnosia. And it's such a great question. There's probably different ways of answering this, but the behind it all is just exploring what somebody can do and trying to eliminate one of these conditions or two of these conditions at a time to allow you to explore the third. And you eliminate by providing tasks or setting up tasks that don't require, for instance, purposeful selection of tool use or actions, or requiring a verbal response for agnosia, and testing apraxia through touch and feel if you feel that there's an agnosia and apraxia present. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling with that one, but hopefully I've been able to get a couple of points across. Thank you. You're very reassuring, Krista. Thank you. But that's a brilliant question. It's one that in practice can be quite challenging. I've just opened up question and answers here. Some really interesting questions coming here. Laurie's question I've answered, haven't I? Yeah, about the Oxford Cognitive Screen. I'll share a link with that. And how do you distinguish apathy from some of the issues with initiation? That's interesting because you probably maybe saw on one of the slides that one of the terms for a lack of initiation can be apathetic dysexecutive executive dysfunction or dysexecutive syndrome. And apathy is it because initiation in relation to executive function is really not associated with emotion and motivation, whereas apathy possibly could be, or with fatigue, for instance, initiation is drawn upon that mechanism where the supplementary motor area and the cingulate gyrus balance each other, where the cingulate gyrus is an activation mechanism and the supplementary motor area inhibits. So together they act, and allow us to be balanced with our initiation, but kept in check, so that our movements and actions are not exaggerated. The one way to distinguish is really through elimination, where if somebody is expressed interest in doing something, they feel that they want to do it, they've been involved in setting it up, but just for some reason they just can't do it, and that points to more of an executive dysfunction initiation issue rather than apathy. But in terms of observing somebody, that can appear apathetic, and very often I think people get labeled by clinicians as being lazy or being difficult because they will observe them initiating things in some situations but not initiating things in other situations. And some of that comes back down to this, whether it was routine or procedural, or whether it was a very conscious and deliberate way. And sometimes routine procedural things just happen automatically, whereas if somebody has the intention and wishes to do something, that's where initiation is difficult, and as a result the person can appear apathetic. Okay, let's come back together. And like I say, I think I've maybe got a couple of bits to add on to from memory. So Michael, oh no, I do have it in there. I thought I'd missed out the agnosia part of it from memory, but what functions may be affected? So we're looking at left-sided spatial attention, left-sided neglect, inattention, whatever you want to call it. So you may be missing things on the left-hand side. Selective attention, the ability again to move that attentional beam in order to hone in on what he needs. That could be an explanation for difficulty actually selecting and items for washing. Object recognition, so there is a possible associative visual agnosia here, and apraxia, possible ideational apraxia, simply because, when you think of the clue from the location of the stroke as well. And this is based on a real life example of a lady who I saw about 3 years ago, and she'd had the left hemisphere stroke, came back in a year later with a right hemisphere stroke, which at that point was pretty devastating because she'd lost all these functions. And theoretically what had happened was her recovery had involved, from her left hemisphere stroke, had involved some of the right hemisphere taking over some of these functions. And when the right hemisphere stroke happened, that recovery was lost because the right hemisphere was no longer supporting the activities of the left hemisphere. And in addition to that, she experienced the difficulties associated with right hemisphere stroke as well. So adapting therapy approaches. So this type of stuff is challenging, but can be worked through. So education in a simple visual format. Okay, and bold, bearing in mind that some of that visual format may not be recognized, but working with Michael in terms of just getting feedback and what he's understanding, what he's picking up with that. Addressing spatial attention by ensuring therapy materials are within intact hemispace. So if he is not responding to things on the left-hand side, rather than, and it's a bit outdated because it used to be common practice was get everything on people's left side who have a left neglect, because that will encourage them to turn to that. And it doesn't. It's just very disorientating because it's not a visual thing. The person has no knowledge that anything is there, and in fact can cause a level of distress with people where, you know, they're not able to attend to things. Or one of the worst situations, probably thinking back, are people who were positioned in a ward situation with a neglected side towards where all the action was, in a misguided attempt at the, you know, sort of encouraging them to turn and take that information in. And what it ended up doing was just isolating the person even further. So ensuring therapy materials are within intact hemispace, simplify therapy to reduce the impact of reduced selective attention. So rather than having 9 things in front of a person, have 1 thing or 2 things in front of Michael. Instructing use of proprioception to support selective and spatial attention. So this is where, you know, it's useful to involve the physical. If somebody's having difficulty directing their attentional field to an object and selectively attending to something, having their hand, having them reach out and feel something, and then using that to inform the direction of their head, and their head position can be useful additional support to have. Address apraxia by using clear, concrete tasks in therapy sessions, because abstract tasks in terms of breaking down. So for instance, somebody's standing from a chair, the abstract way of doing that is instructions such as scoot forward, hands on arms, feet back, shoulders over toes, that type of things. Very broken down, but it makes it a lot more complex. So, and apraxia is probably going to be it's probably going to make the practice going to make it more difficult for the person to respond to that, rather than, right, I'd like you to, you know, see what's on the wall over there. And if the person is able to walk, presumably, then that can be a clearer instruction. So clear, concrete tasks in therapy sessions, and then provide instructions through visual demonstration, including video, particularly in relation to the apraxia, and actually observing how something should be taking place. Okay. And I think I'll just check for any comments. All right, I see there's a chat comment there. Could you tell us how you assessed her possible ideational apraxia in this scenario and not motor apraxia? Okay, now is that related to the lady that you know, I was speaking about earlier on? It was very difficult because, you know, again, she had no language, her comprehension seemed very poor as well. So everything was done in very much demonstration of objects. Had a few sessions where she would sit in a therapy room and there was either 2, 3 or 4 objects, and her task was to actually take an object and demonstrate its use within that. And naturally, you know, it was quite difficult at first, but it actually remained difficult because of the different effects that were on her. We got to the stage where she was recognizing some things, particularly when she had them in hand, but her apraxia actually persisted in that situation. But in terms of the ideational apraxia, it was very much looking to determine whether she had the concept of how she was to use things. So 2 stages there. One is, and this is based on the fact that generally if somebody's got a hold of something, you know, they will know how to use it. Not always, but they will know it's giving them that tactile and proprioceptive information by holding it. So the stage before that is just really determining, is presented with a hairbrush, for instance, you know, how would you use that hairbrush? And in order to give her the actual idea of that, another object like telephone, and putting and demonstrating the miming of the telephone to ear, and then showing her the brush and letting her demonstrate it. I have to be honest, and it was a very difficult thing, and she actually never regained the ability to do a lot of things, but we did manage to come down to the fact that it was more of an apraxia. There was elements where it looked as if she wasn't recognizing certain objects, but actually to this day you still can't even be sure of that. It was really quite severe. I hope that answers that question, Sarah. And then Laurelyn, given time, environmental constraints, and acute care, do you have assessment recommendations for people who are independent in self-care? And team are asking about cognitive safety for discharge home and return to instrumental activities of daily living when they live. This is a great one, isn't there? Is there a specific functional test or a specific cognitive screen you would suggest? If it's a stroke patient, I certainly would recommend the Oxford cognitive screen, because it does go through each area, and rather than using a tool that is designed for dementia, the Oxford cognitive screen of course also has the part on attention, spatial awareness with the Hearts test. It also has an apraxia section in it, as well as the trail making section. But now you might want to do this informally, but if I don't know if you've ever used a tool called the RUDAS. It's the Roland University. It's Australian. I can't even recall offhand what it stands for, but it's actually got scenario questions. It's like any other cognitive screen, but at the end of it, I think there's a couple of questions on how would you cross the road safely, how would you do certain things. But there is a word of caution with that, in that, again, thinking back to the working memory argument, sometimes people can talk a good game, but they, in practice, if their working memory is overloaded, they have difficulty in executing. So somebody might be able to tell you, how they're going to stay safe in a situation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do it. So that's where the whole functional elements there, integrating levels of complexity, etc., come into their own when somebody is in a hospital and appreciated it. Certainly in an acute setting, there is not much time at all. So to do these quick screens, but actually support it with anything in the kitchen, and it might not necessarily be related to a task that they're planning to do at home, but it gives you an idea of how they are with problem solving and maintaining safety. If you do actually assess them in for instance, a kitchen type setup. Okay. Similarly with other professions as well, up and down the stairs, how somebody's responding to that, can give a lot of clues as well about somebody's level of awareness and safety awareness. And then we have a comment here. So often with ADL training with a person with unilateral neglect, we do set things up on affected side so that scanning to that side becomes less conscious and more automatic. But sometimes there are conflicting strategies, want to scan, but also to have persons succeed but work on executive function without the load and demand of also having to attend. Seems to be variable and dependent on the person and goals for that. Would you agree? Oh, absolutely. I think that's a great thing. Just a little bit to add on there, and there is a thing that develops somebody's procedural function, and rather than having them just scan to one side, which with many people, as far as they're concerned, they've got nothing to scan for, it does not exist in that side, is the head turning technique. And it's just asking them to, without looking for anything, turn your head all the way to the left hand side until you can't go any further, and then look for the thing as you turn back around. So what you're actually getting the person to practice is using their intact hemispace to actually look for the thing as they come back around, rather than shifting their unattended hemispace into the location where the items of interest or stimuli are. And because it's just a clear motion that doesn't depend on an action of looking for something, it's just a head turning technique, it can become procedural, become habitual for somebody. But I certainly agree that it's very dependent on the person themselves and their ability. Would it be helpful in this case to label items, name them, demonstrate their use, and use the teach back method to ask if Michael is able to choose an item, name it, and demonstrate its use? Yes, absolutely. One of the key things with agnosia, be it apperceptive or associative, is labeling, but also keeping things in consistent locations, using color coding, so the person has got, and Michael would be able to know where things are located, be able to read the label to make sure that it is what he needs and wants at that time. But using these combination of methods can be really quite helpful, again depending on the individual and depending on their level of working memory. So bringing the other cognitive factors in here, there are some people that the use of these strategies that will work well with. There are others because it would overload their working memory or be too great for their attentional ability, and it is a case of very much individualizing these techniques, but having it as a tool kit to be able to individualize towards each individual. Okay, now I think there was a couple of questions there. Oh, apologies for this. I'm seeing 2 open questions, but I don't seem to be able to bring them up. I've got answered 3 questions and open 2. I'm still seeing Laurie's question and the question from BG. How do you distinguish apathy? So if I'm missing something, would you mind just putting it in the chat? I seem to see these. Now, Shonaget, how do you expand capacity for working memory? Now, the thing about working memory is if you think about brain training games and all these kinds of things, these all tend to be working memory. The only problem with that is commercially available types of games and software tend to be too complex for many of the people that we work with. So the practice of these elements involves a grading process. So as a very simple example, one of the things I do quite commonly is deck of cards. And what the person's first task is to do is to separate the cards into red and black cards. Okay? And most people will be able to do that. And that's useful because in doing this cognitive work and using cognitive strategies, we don't want somebody to experience just difficulty and non-success and failure. It's important to balance out things that people can achieve and do with things that they find more difficult. So starting tasks with sessions with things they definitely can do is important because most people will be able to split into red and black. Then you can grade that up and just ask them to do red, black, but I want a third pile this time, and that's all of the picture cards into the third pile. So then they do that, and if they're able to do that, then you can move it even further. This time I would like you to do red, black, picture cards, but every time you have a card that's value is 4 and lower and ace is low, and we want you to make a fourth pile. So you get the idea there. It's becoming more complex each time, and that is a very abstract type of game type task. So so the next step would be applying that to real life types of activities where the person starts off with a simple activity. If it's say if it's again, I apologize to all the non-occupational therapy professions for this, but sometimes kitchen and cooking is sometimes the easiest examples to use. Starting off with sort of one part task and then building upon that task so that the person has to coordinate information. And the example of that might be to prepare a hot drink, to prepare coffee, for instance. The starting point to that might be to set up a game type activity in the kitchen where the person's got to pour water from a jug into so many, maybe 2 or 3 different glasses, and then add to them doing that, and they also have to bring out so many things from the cupboard in between putting water in glasses, etc. So in that way, what you're doing is you've brought it into a more real life situation. It's still a bit abstract in terms of that, but the demands you're building up so that the person's having to simultaneously process and keep things in mind. And that is probably the essence of working memory work and where people experience challenges of not being able to coordinate so much information. But certainly the key ingredient is being able to start simple and grade upwards in different ways, whether it's the number of task stages, whether it's the number of objects used, whether it's to be able to do something in a shorter period of time as well. And with some of the abstract tasks, to turn these into games is useful, to be able to do so many things, one thing within this 1 minute, how many, and then the person's set to try and beat their record the next time, and it can make some of these activities a lot more engaging. Okay, I think that's covered the questions there. Quick time. Wow, we are actually over time at the moment, but thank you very much for all the questions coming in. Like I said at the start of all, I was going to try to hold some time, but actually, because the time has been taken discussing some of the questions and comments that have come in, I felt that hopefully that's been very valuable as well. So the key take-home messages, again, this is the slide from the presentation. Cognitive and perceptual changes can impact on people's rehabilitation. Identifying the cognitive domains that are affected and addressing these in our sessions can improve the quality of participation in rehabilitation. And as you've seen, many of this, it's not difficult to do with much of this. A lot of it involves simplification, really cutting back on the information that somebody has to process and playing to their strengths, depending on what side the stroke is on. Is it visual? Is it verbal information that we need to work on? And management strategies may include some restorative work, for instance, in terms of, can somebody's attention be improved a bit? A lot of adaptive methods and or environmental changes. And perceptual changes can be difficult to detect, and as in the question that was given there, as they're often masked by other stroke-related changes, for instance, aphasia, apraxia, and the impact of perceptual changes in apraxia can be addressed through specific strategies. So the more we know, the more we can profile somebody's abilities and their cognitive profile, the more we can bring in specific strategies, which hopefully, will, be more effective than just using general strategies. So hopefully, people can still be around to just undertake the poll questions, and I apologize for running over. Thank you, Barb, that's great. While you're doing that, I'll say a couple more. Thank you for your comments, that's very kind.
I'm going to give another few seconds, but I'm seeing lots of higher numbers.
That's great. No, but actually, for the references, there is a reference list. I think I've maybe not sent it to you, Barb, yet, but there's a reference list for everything that's in the presentation. And
please send it on. I'll post it with all our materials.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll send it along with the Oxford Cognitive Screen link as well.
So here's our results from the post-workshop knowledge. We've got mostly 5, 6, and 7s. We didn't have everyone participate there, but that's encouraging.
Sure. That's great, isn't it? Yes, there's a shift. That's the main thing.
That's good.
Yes, I've not taken 3 hours of your lives this afternoon plus the couple of hours presentation without having some kind of impact.
And what about your post-workshop confidence in working with these patients?
Yeah. Yes, and thank you for these comments. That's great. And thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. And I hope to get back to Canada at some point. I had a wonderful time in 2018. And, there's no replacement for actually the face-to-face, because it is challenging to present and discuss when, you can't see anybody. Okay, that's great as well. So similar pattern, there has been a gradual shift up. And what I would say, just to finish things off, is that please feel free to contact me, Twitter, email, however you want to do it. If there's any further information, anything else you would like to discuss. And I really do enjoy the engagement from people who have been on the workshops.
That's an amazing offer, sharing your email, Charlie.
Sure.
I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. Thank you very much for traveling from Scotland today to do the workshop for us. This is, like I said, the pandemic bonus that we can do this. We'd love to see you in Canada when it's possible. I hope everyone enjoyed this format. And if you didn't do the recorded workshop, I encourage you to do so. It's really packed with information for you, and it will just consolidate even more what you learned today. Thank you, Charlie. I thought it was great, and I hope we do see you again. And thank you to everyone who participated. You are going to receive an email from me probably a few minutes ago, asking you to complete an evaluation of the workshop. And I always welcome your suggestions, and I can share the feedback with Charlie when I have it. And I will send you a follow-up email of all the resources, the recordings, the recording of this session, and the resource list that Charlie's going to send me. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barb. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.